All right, let's dive right into one of the most controversial and honestly unsettling chapters in all of medical history, the prefrontal lobotomy. And we're going to explore it in a really unique way, not just looking back, but by seeing it through the eyes of the man who championed it, Dr. Walter Freeman, using his very own words from 1942 as our guide. Just listen to that. That's a direct quote from Dr. Freeman describing one of his patients. It paints an absolutely brutal picture of what life was like for someone with severe mental illness back then. Asylums were overflowing, and there were basically no effective treatments. This was the world that led people to search for a desperate cure. So yeah, let's really step into that world for a moment to even begin to understand why a procedure as extreme as a lobotomy was ever even considered. You have to feel the sheer overwhelming hopelessness that both patients and their doctors were up against every single day. I mean, for thousands and thousands of people suffering from things like schizophrenia or crippling depression, the future was just bleak. You were confined to an institution, often for life, with almost zero hope of ever getting better. That grim reality is what fueled this almost frantic search for some kind of physical fix, a way to literally go in and surgically alter a mind that seemed completely untreatable. And this is where Dr. Walter Freeman, an American neurologist, and his neurosurgeon partner, James Watts, enter the picture. Now, they weren't the very first to think about operating on the brain to change the mind, but they were the ones who were going to package it, standardize it, and popularize it in a way that would leave a permanent mark on medical history. You know, the idea of psychosurgery didn't just appear out of thin air. You can see on this timeline its roots go way, way back to ancient trepanation, drilling holes in skulls. But for our story, the really key moment is in 1935 with a Portuguese neurologist named Egas Moniz. His work is what directly lit the fire under Freeman and Watts to take his idea and turn it into what they thought would be a definitive cure. So here was the theory. It's actually pretty simple, in a brutal way. They believed that all that mental suffering, the constant worry, the anxiety, the delusions, was caused by faulty emotional circuits that were kind of stuck in a loop in the frontal lobes of the brain. So they figured, what if you could just physically cut those connections? You couldn't fix the thought itself, but you could snip the wire connecting the thought to its painful emotional power. So how did they actually do it? How do you put that theory into practice? Well, the procedure itself was shockingly direct. And you have to remember, this was often performed on patients who were completely wide awake. Freeman and Watts described the operation with this chilling clinical detachment. First, a bit of local anesthetic. Then, they would literally drill 2 holes into the patient's skull right above the temples. Then, they'd insert an instrument called a leucotome. Think of it like a long, sharp knife, deep into the brain, and just sweep it up and down, severing everything in its path. And this next slide, this has what might be one of the most haunting quotes in the history of medicine. It comes from a patient, a merchant, spoken during his own operation. "I am still fully conscious. I am a good guinea pig." It's just a stark, unbelievable reminder that these people were awake, able to talk about what was happening as their brain was being changed forever. But what happened after? What were people like once the surgery was over? Freeman's book is packed with these incredibly detailed observations of the aftermath. And what he presented as a cure can seem, well, profoundly disturbing to us today. He was literally documenting the creation of a new personality. Right after the operation, patients would enter this strange state of confusion and, well, inertia. They just sort of existed. Freeman himself had a name for it. He called it a surgical childhood. The terrible anxiety might be gone, sure, but so was a huge part of their awareness, their drive, their adult personality. Just look at this list. This describes the behavior of one of Freeman's patients, who was a businessman before the surgery. Picking paint for hours, slapping nurses, pulling a fire alarm just to see what would happen, sitting in a bathtub fully clothed. And the thing is, these weren't seen as tragic side effects. In Freeman's book, this was the documented outcome. This complete loss of inhibition was part of the cure. And this right here, this quote illustrates the core change perfectly. When they asked the patient why he pulled the fire alarm, he couldn't really explain it. But the key part of his answer is, "Before I did it, I couldn't tell whether or not it would be the right thing to do." The surgery had basically erased his ability to imagine the future, to weigh consequences. This comparison really just lays the trade-off bare with brutal clarity. Before, you have a woman trapped by this agonizingly complex bathing ritual. After, she's sitting in a tub with her shoes on, oblivious, surrounded by torn-up paper. The procedure didn't just get rid of the obsession. In many cases, it wiped out the basic building blocks of adult behavior. And this is so important to understand. From the patient's point of view, the relief could feel like a miracle. This woman, who had suffered from intense depression, described her new mind as so much easier. For someone who had been living in a private hell of constant mental torment, this quieting of the mind, this, cognitive simplification, it could feel like a genuine escape. So, how on earth are we supposed to make sense of this? What's the takeaway from this absolutely brutal chapter in medical history? It's messy, and it leaves you with a really complicated, uncomfortable feeling. The sheer scale of it all is just mind-boggling. Before new medications came along in the 1950s and made it obsolete, over 40,000 lobotomies were performed in the United States alone. This wasn't some fringe experiment happening in a basement. For a time, this was a mainstream medical treatment. Now, it's really important to say that the field has changed dramatically. Modern neurosurgery for mental disorders is a completely different universe. It uses incredibly precise, targeted techniques to gently adjust very specific brain circuits, and it's done with an extremely high degree of safety and ethical oversight. Which brings us back to this central, impossible question. Was it a cure or was it mutilation? Freeman and his supporters truly believed they were heroes, freeing people from the prisons of their own minds. But critics saw a barbaric procedure that destroyed the very soul of a person. And the truth, as it often is somewhere in that uncomfortable, complex middle. Ultimately, the story of the lobotomy is one of the most powerful cautionary tales in all of science. It's the stark, unavoidable reminder that the noble goal of healing and relieving suffering has to be balanced with a deep, profound respect for the complexity and integrity of the human mind. And that leaves us with one last, pretty provocative thought. The lobotomy was a surgical attempt to just cut suffering out of the brain. But in doing so, it often cut out essential parts of our personality, our foresight, ourselves. It forces us to ask a really difficult question. In the quest to end pain, what part of our humanity are we willing to sacrifice?